It's great to see you all. It's class number 3 tonight. And before we continue, please make sure you turned in your homework. And does everyone have the Being a People Helper book? Okay, so how you doing with the homework? Yes, Rebecca?
Which chapter is this week?
2.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty much the class number corresponds with the chapter in the book for the white book. Okay? So you should have now, you should have handed in chapters 1 and 2, and then you should have received tonight 3 and 4. 3 and 4 is only I hand out 2 every other week so that you can get ahead if you want, but you don't have to do both by next week. Just you do 3 for the third week. You have them? Okay. Okay. So we can hand those out maybe when you come back from the break. And okay, does that make sense? Any questions about the homework? So remember, the class number corresponds with the chapter, and just look at the syllabus if there's any confusion. Okay. All right. Hope you're enjoying the course so far. And so tonight we're talking about helping others recover from their losses in life. So this is a very relevant theme. If you've lived any number of years, and I can see that you all have, then you have suffered losses. Maybe small losses or maybe gigantic losses. But part of being a person is to experience loss. Maybe the loss was the little goldfish when you were 2 years old, and you wondered when you said, "Mommy, why is my goldfish floating on the water sideways?" And your mother said, "Oh, honey, little Jimmy died," or whatever your goldfish was. And of course, and it's like, "Oh my goodness, how could my fish die? I mean, what is die?" And then, it's your introduction to loss, and it wasn't a fun experience. And maybe it lasted 60 seconds, because then Mommy said, "Would you like a cookie?" And all of a sudden you forgot about the goldfish, and the cookie was on your mind. But that's a little introduction to losses in life. And so we'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about grief, and not the most fun subjects, but we are all about helping people, so it helps us to understand these things so that we can be better equipped to help others. I would like to just read a couple paragraphs from this book, Psychology in the Church, and I wrote it for you. And it says, and it's just comparing psychotherapy with scriptural biblical counseling. And we could have a course on the two, but that is not the focus of this course. If you answer the question, which is older, the scriptures or psychotherapy? And I think the scriptures have it by a long shot. I mean, we're going back to the late 1800s, perhaps, when psychotherapy came about. And it has, in my opinion, insidiously and slowly, insidiously, and almost thoroughly now has affected the church. And really the downside of that is saying that perhaps the scriptures are inspired, but they're not sufficient. And so, I can get into trouble going down this road because there's a balance, but just allow me to read this and then we'll get into our subject. But I'm saying this so that you'll kind of have a sense when you study and when you hear things, a discerning spirit, to say, okay, now, this is what I'm hearing. Now, what do the scriptures say? And if it aligns, wonderful. But just, go through that exercise when you hear things, and have a discerning ear. And be a Berean, because it has really come into the evangelical church across America and in other places as well in the West. So this is Dave Hunt in this article. This chapter is by T.A. McMahon. And he says, if psychotherapy isn't truly the scientific pursuit of humanity's mental, emotional, and behavioral well-being, his point is that it's not really scientific. It's not a hard science. And so he says, then what is it? And the answer is, it's talk, rhetoric, conversation. Research psychiatrist Thomas Szasz, S-Z-A-S-Z, I think I'm pronouncing it right, in his book, The Myth of Psychotherapy, and he is a secular psychotherapist, and he is a researcher. So the myth of psychotherapy, mental healing as religion, rhetoric, and regression, which is the name of his book, burns off clinical psychology's scientific mist. And here's a quote from him. In plain language, what do patient and psychotherapists actually do? So you want to look, what's going on in that room? What are they taught? What's going on? And how is the healing taking place? What do they speak about? Narrowly put, the patient speaks about himself, and the therapist speaks about the patient. Each tries to move the other to see or do things in a certain way. So that's what's really going on. In the counseling room is a lot of talk. And then the author says, this then is neither brain surgery nor any other form of medical intervention, nor is it rocket science. In other words, a PhD or MD is not a necessary requirement to handle the medium of talk. Yet, wouldn't advanced degrees make one more effective in the psychotherapeutic conversation process? The many research studies comparing the effectiveness of professional therapists versus non-professionals have given equivalent results. In other words, non-professionals do as well as professionals. So, may sound strange, but how much more, if we have the mind of Christ and the Holy Spirit, are we then equipped to be people helpers? Okay, so I say that because there can be a sense of intimidation when it comes to the word counselor. Like, I'm not a counselor, I'm just a Christian. Well, think about, and I wrote down the verse here, 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, and as we start, I would like to read these two verses. So it says, all Scripture is inspired by God. It is God-breathed. And you say, oh, I know this verse. I memorized it in Sunday school. But think about it in the context of being a counselor, or maybe a better word is a minister. And it says, all Scripture is inspired by God and is profitable for teaching. So that means it tells us what's right. And for reproof, it tells us what's wrong. For correction, it gets what's wrong right. And training in righteousness, it keeps us right. So as someone has put it succinctly, the Scriptures tell us what's wrong, tells us what's right, tells us how to make what's wrong right, and tells us how to keep it right. That's what the Scriptures do. Isn't that good? So, what's wrong, what's right, what's wrong, how to get it right, how to keep it right. It's the Scriptures. That the man of God, and we can say woman of God, may be adequate. Notice that, may be adequate. You want to be adequate in ministering? Then the answers are in the book, right here. So, may be adequate, and then equipped for every good work. Now, every good work does not include, as we've said before, If you have a shoulder that's out of joint, don't go to your pastor. Go to the hospital. If you have a fever, you can go to your pastor for prayer, but may he then send you on your way to the clinic or somewhere to get the help that you need for your cold. But if you have soul issues, if there are issues in the emotions, issues with making right decisions, issues of conflict, then, yeah, go see your pastor. Read the scriptures, pray, and that's the right place to go for issues of life. Okay, so now we go to our class, this theme of loss. So you'll notice when you read right, there's a lot of information in there, and you may feel like you're almost reading an encyclopedia, and you may feel a little bit lost in all the details. I don't know. Give me some feedback. You like the book? Does it seem a little too much to digest, or is it good? I don't want to speak bad about the book, and then when you read it, be thinking, yeah, Pastor Hadley said this isn't a good book. Well, it wouldn't be a course text if it wasn't a good book. So, but okay, good. I hope you enjoy it. And it's also a resource tool, something you can put on your bookshelf, and you come to an issue. Someone needs help, and maybe, or yourself, and so you go, yeah, I remember studying something about that, a little vague, but I'm going to go back and look in the chapter, and it's all underlined and asterisks and highlighted, but I can't remember exactly what it was, so I'm going to refresh myself. So this issue of loss, you remember at the beginning of the chapter, talked about the man who had, in short, the wife got a new husband back. Remember, he lived in depression, and he ended up going to, I think in this case it was a vineyard church, and he worshiped and he praised God, and what he did most of that time was cry. And he wept because he was made aware of the losses in his life that he never grieved over, that he never really dealt with. And it took some working through, but he came to the place where the depression lifted because he identified those things in his life that were never talked about, that were losses, and dealt with them one by one until he came to the place where he really felt liberated, and the depression left. And I think that's very interesting.
Was that under ambiguous losses? There was one.
No, that's right at the beginning of the chapter, on the introduction, I believe. So there's this little phrase, grief work. Anyone, have you ever done grief work before? Oh, it's terrible work. It's terrible, but it's work that we have to do. And when we don't do our grief work, then it's unresolved, and it's waiting for us. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but when we suffer a loss, we repress the grief, then it's going to ooze out in other areas, and it's going to come out somehow, some way, and maybe even years down the road. So we'll talk about that actually in the next chapter. So what about this four-letter word that we never say? Loss. What is loss? Have you had loss before? I think you have. And actually, it's a very major theme because Jesus came to seek and save that which was lost. So that's us in Luke 19:10. We are lost. We were born lost, and then we came to know the Lord, and then we were saved. But nevertheless, our life is a series of losses in this cycle of life. Isn't it amazing that, we're born and we come into the world, and we're, how do we start our movement, our locomotion? we start by, the crawling, and then the crawling faster, and then the walking and the falling, and then the walking, and then the growing, and then the running, and then adulthood, and then midlife, and then over the hill. And isn't it amazing that we just we end up starting going this way again. We up and then back down again. And until we can't move, and then we return to the dust. Isn't that a happy theme? But isn't that what happens? We're back to the dust. And gravity has its effect on all of us. It pulls us back to the earth. And that's where our bodies are temporarily going. And I say with a big smile, temporarily, because there will be a resurrection. And for us believers, it is a glorious resurrection. It is sown in corruption. It is raised in incorruption. And anyways, that's not a theology course tonight, but just to inject some hope in this dismal theme that we are addressing tonight. So some of the points that he brings out is that loss is not always negative because it can affect change in our life, and that depends actually how we look at it. And there's also, we'll talk about, there's positive loss as well as negative loss. So normally it produces negative emotions, and it certainly can disrupt our life. And there can be long-term repercussions from losses. Loss can be, for example, I remember being 5 years old and losing the sense of security of my mother's presence as she walked me down Stedman Street and around the corner to the Westland School in Chelmsford, Massachusetts. And I was walking with my mom, 5 years old, like, where are we going? Oh, you're going to school, you're going to have a fun time. I don't think so. And I remember looking up a big old school and big windows, those huge windows and brick and wow, and looking up the stairs and, okay, honey, have a good day. And I was horrified. And I remember first grade, Miss Kevel. I remember her name, Miss Kevel. And she was a great teacher, but I remember the first day of school, and I can still see her face squatting down, looking at me, trying to console me and tell me that everything was going to be okay, that it was, it was fine. And I didn't believe her. And I just remember, and I remember at recess, 5 years old, at recess I escaped and I went home. And I walked all the way home, 5 years old, there's no sidewalk, and my mother's in the kitchen. She turned around, she goes, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I don't want to go to school." And so back I went, and the interesting thing was no one even noticed I was gone. So trying to tell her all along it wasn't a safe place. She wouldn't listen to me. So I remember that sense of loss, like my little safe world all of a sudden wasn't safe anymore as I went out to the big bad world. So that was, in a sense, that was a loss. He brings out that loss does not mean loser. But, we're not taught. We don't go to school learning about losing. I don't know of any, courses on loss or having our parents sit us down and say, now in life you'll go through a lot of losses, and this is how you should approach them, and let's have a little class about that. I mean, it's like no one really talks about it, but it's everywhere, and it's all the time in different people's lives. So our culture has an intolerance really for suffering. We want people to know, we want people we know who have had a loss to basically get over it. Kind of like, okay, yeah, I understand. It's It's been difficult, but I remember somebody in the church who lost a spouse, and this was quite a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago. And I really respected this person, but she lost her husband, and it was probably a year later, and it was obvious that she was still mourning. And I remember thinking to myself, just that very thing, like, what is the problem? I mean, it's been so long. Why don't you just get over it? I mean, in so many words, I didn't say those words, but basically that's what I was thinking. And then I had my turn to go through something, and that came back to me, and I was appalled at myself. But I didn't have a clue. How could I know? How do you know what it's like until it's happened to you? And then all of a sudden you have such empathy, and we realize how narrow we were in our understanding of how people suffer. And so that's why we're on this theme of loss. Okay, so loss requires identification. And as you saw in the book, Dr. Wright here had a chart, had someone make a timeline, and right on that timeline, there are losses. And then go back and extend the line, which would signify the intensity of the loss, and then up to the present, and then look at those losses that maybe were never identified, and then thinking, okay, what about this? Have I really dealt with these things? And have I grieved over the losses? Because sometimes when we don't, there's kind of this free-floating anxiety that we don't identify and wonder why I feel this way. And, okay, now am I being psychological? I want to just take this and then go to the scriptures. But think about it. Should we just, is it okay to say, hey, I'm a Christian, and it's under the blood, and hey, life goes on. I am more than a conqueror. I'm victorious. I can do all things through Christ. I don't even need to think about those things. And I would say that's true too. But if you don't need to think about them, then you don't need to think about them. But if there's a problem, then okay, maybe it's good to think about these things. Okay, so I don't know if you took out a piece of paper and you wrote down the losses that you have suffered since as far back as you can remember, and you were to look at each one of those and say, okay, how did that affect me? Does it still affect me today? Am I who I am because of the influence of these things? And would I be changed if I went back and thought about that and said, okay, I'm cut from the football team, all through school I was always going to be on the football team. I was going to be the quarterback, and what's his name beat me out, and they didn't need me, and I was devastated. And I've carried that devastation and had an attitude of failure because of that all these years. I don't know. And we go back and we go in prayer and say, Lord, this happened to me, and I'm putting it before you, and I'm just asking you to heal me of the pain that I felt in being cut from the football team. You think God could do that? You think that's important? And I'm saying if it's important to you, then it is important. And if it's not, it's not. It's like, what is your need? And whatever the need is, God is able to meet it. But I had someone in my office recently, and first thing they said when they came in was, I'm depressed. Then we kind of reviewed the recent history, And there had to be a half a dozen major things that were really troubling to this person, and they were troubling. Marriage, family, employment, the finances, the whole thing. And there were some major issues that needed to be addressed. And after we talked and identified those and said what they were, it was obvious, you have a reason to feel depressed because you feel like your life is out of control. And these are the issues, and these are serious, major issues. And all of a sudden there was a big smile on the person's face. Like, oh, you mean I have a reason to be depressed? It's like, well, now I don't feel so depressed now that I know why I feel depressed. It's exactly what happened. And so we talked about it. We talked about solutions for each one of those issues. And it's just wonderful to see, well, someone comes in just kind of heavy and, no evidence of any joy. And then to see people leave your office, not with a Band-Aid superficial, make you feel good kind of approach, but really going into the issues and leaving with a sense of direction and a future hope. It's beautiful. Okay. Glory to God for that. So, so I'm going to move along because of so much stuff here. But the second point in his chapter was how do we discuss loss, and that's when he talked about the timeline. And if you think that would be helpful, or if you think it would be helpful for someone that you're ministering to, then it's a tool in your counseling toolbox, and you can certainly feel free to use that. I think with loss, I think of the Apostle Paul, and he had his philosophy on loss in Philippians 3:7 and 8. And he said, the things which I counted as gain, I now count as loss. And he said, why? That he would win Christ. So there's someone who is so filled with the Spirit and who is so after God that his losses, as long as the loss brings me closer to Christ, then that's my goal. I mean, that's the place he was in. But I think someone's level of faith, one's level of faith determines, which way, determines what helps the most. And so for Paul, he counted everything as loss to win Christ. But let's face it, most people aren't there, and maybe we're not a lot of the time as well. So, to counsel Paul in these things, what do you say to Paul? He just goes, I rejoice. May he take it all. I don't care. Because for me to live is Christ. And even if I die, well, even that's a plus. So someone like that doesn't need a whole lot of counseling. But that's beautiful. So what do we know about loss? Losses often go unrecognized. And then he says change involves loss of the way things used to be. We suffer a major loss, and then we hear the saying, the new normal. All of a sudden there's a new normal. We wake up one morning and we go, wow, my life is upside down. Things will never be the same. And, yeah, it's true. But all of a sudden time passes, and all of a sudden, yes, our life is different, but then there's a new normal. And then maybe down the road, that new normal is going to change, and then there's another normal. And by the time we probably get 80 years old, we're just about sick of it and say, I've had about enough of this. I'm ready to go home. And we're all a day closer than we were yesterday. So what are some different types of losses? I've added a couple, and there are 10 losses, and we'll list these. 10 different types of losses. Number one, there is, I changed it, he said unspeakable losses, but that To me, that sounds like a loss so great that you can't even speak about it, but that's not what he means by it. He means, I've named it a private loss. And a private loss is a loss, but a loss that is personal, that you don't talk about. It's, as he lists, miscarriage, for example, for a woman, a stillborn, an abortion, or even someone who finds out they can't get pregnant. This is something that a person carries in themselves and not maybe recognized by others as a loss. Also, the loss of, that comes with aging. The loss of, someone says, I think it's probably more apparent with women because they're, so beauty conscious, and that's a good thing. But, my skin isn't the way it used to be. I remember when I was a kid, my skin was so tight, and, and now it's got wrinkles, and, is that a loss? Yeah. It's like, oh, look at this, look at that. Look at the guys, my muscle tone. Look at my muscles now. I used to be a fit athlete, and look at me now, just hobbling along. That's a loss. And for some, that's a big loss. That's a heavy-duty loss. Athletic ability, hair, right? Hair. My hair's falling out. All those things are losses. Number two, there's frequent losses. As we age, the losses become more frequent. I'm thinking of 3 people who just passed here in the church within, 2 weeks of each other? Actually, they were all from Massachusetts. It was Danny O'Neill, I don't know if you knew Danny. It was Lee Mitchell, and it was Peggy Grant. And all of a sudden, 3 people that I've known since way back in the 70s, not Peggy, I didn't know her from the 70s, but from the 90s, but Danny especially from the 70s. And all of a sudden, these dear saints are gone. And then when you as you grow, all of a sudden you realize, wow, my dad just died. I just heard someone else's dad just died. Someone else's mom just died. And all of a sudden you realize that people your age, we're all going through the same thing. And then as we get older, then it becomes our generation, and then this friend is gone, and that friend is gone, and it just seems like it's happening faster and faster. And then one day, the news comes that we're gone. We're going to break out into, oh, happy day right now. Oh, happy day. For to us, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. And yes, we say that jokingly, but it's okay when we go, but when we do, you can bet that probably there'll be a lot of broken-hearted people, and we will represent, our gain will be their loss, because all of a sudden their life isn't normal anymore because we're gone. And that's just the way it goes. So that was number 2, frequent losses. He says gradual losses, and I put eventual losses. Those are the things that seem, this is familiar to me, like maybe from last week, but someone who, the parent anticipates that, okay, 2 years, you're going to graduate from high school and you're moving off to college. That's a gradual loss, an anticipated loss, and it may not seem like anything, but, parents really go through it. Their child, my baby, you're leaving the house and going off to school. Yes, see you later. And all of a sudden they're happy to go. And the parents, they're gone to school. Freshman year, they walk in their bedroom and look, it can be tough. And the empty nest syndrome, and those are losses. People don't think of them as losses, but they are losses. And then we have number 4, accumulated losses. That's somewhat similar to what we already said. But after midlife, as you're recovering from one loss, which is difficult to deal with, then there's loss upon loss. And when that happens, usually a crisis ensues because, again, the coping skills are inadequate to for us to remain emotionally stable during those times when we feel like we're hit extra hard. Number 5, there's a final or permanent loss. And that can be job loss at the age of 60, for example, loss of a spouse later in life, and just think what it's like to have lost a spouse, and then you're filling out a form for something, and it says, single, married, and everything in the person wants to write, well, married. I've been married for 50 years. How? Of course I'm going to check married. And then their logical, rational mind says, but you're not married. You are widowed. Can you imagine the difficulty of checking the widowed box when you've been married for half a century? It happens. It's amazing. Life can be cruel, but God is greater. And so, an unfavorable diagnosis. Yeah, can I see you in my office? The doctor says, I got to tell you some bad news. And then we get the news, and it could represent a permanent loss. Or someone loses a limb, or a diabetic loses a foot, or a toe, or a leg. All those things are losses. Number 6, identity loss, which is kind of less tangible, but still it's very real. An identity loss. Someone is demoted at work for whatever reason. Someone is replaced all of a sudden. But that's not, what I do is who I am. And now what I do I'm not doing, so therefore who am I? And those things can be very real and very painful. Threatened losses, number 7. There's a layoff coming. Oh boy, is it going to be me? And if it is me, then what does that mean? The company's downsizing. Uh-oh. What does that mean? Or the spouse says, I'm thinking of divorcing you. That certainly is a threatened loss. And, I just might sue you. Uh-oh. That's the last thing I need. Those things could represent a loss. And then that was number 7. Number 8, voluntary losses. You can have voluntary loss. That is loss by choice. Can you think of a voluntary loss? Yes, Dakota. Yeah, that was the loss of all losses, and then the gain of all gains, right? Yeah. Someone said a kidney. Yeah, that's a voluntary loss. Sure, a kidney. There are good voluntary losses. For example, I've decided to stop sinning in the sin. That's a good voluntary loss, isn't it? I've decided to lose weight. That's a good voluntary loss, right? All those things. John 12:24 and 25. Jesus said, if we save our life, we'll lose it. If we lose our life, for his sake, we'll gain it. So that's a verse of all verses. I just remember thinking about that. Like, lose my life. How could I? It's impossible. How can you lose your life? Our strongest instinct is survival. But then the Holy Spirit makes it possible for us to give our life to him and then and only then are we free. And the next one is, a good loss also is bad friends. You ever had a bad friend before? Friend influencing you in the wrong way? Evil associations corrupt good manners. Remember that verse? Yeah, so it's just interesting. I remember when I got saved, almost all my friends just vanished. They were gone. Stopped calling me, stopped coming over, and all I did was tell them about Jesus. But God gave me many, many 100 times more friends than I had before. And then there's spiritual loss, and this is 1 John 8. He talks about, John says, don't lose what you have wrought. Don't lose what you have worked for, but receive a full reward. That's a terrible loss, a loss of reward. Worked hard, 30 years in Christian life, and then the last 10 backslide and whatever. I don't know exactly what that means, but that's what John said in 1 John 8. He said, don't lose what you've worked for, but receive a full reward. So that's like just running, like Paul said, I have run the race, I've finished my course, there's a reward set before me. So we want to encourage each other to run the race right to the end. And then, of course, terrible truth of Revelation 20:15, that those who will be lost forever in the lake of fire. Okay, take a breather. How you doing? No, don't leave yet, but just, okay. So, loss, material loss. This is all in your book. Material loss, relationship loss. So much we could say about these. He calls it intrapsychic loss, meaning kind of self-image loss. Functional loss. I can't need crutches now. Yes.
What is the difference between self-image loss and identity loss?
Pardon?
The difference between self-image loss and identity loss?
Yeah, I think they're pretty synonymous, actually. Yeah. And then he talks about functional loss, role loss, change of a career, retirement. What part do I play now? All of those. Systemic loss. Did we talk about that before? Systemic loss. I'm part of the, we're part of the team. This is how we function in the company, on the field. And all of a sudden, the key player is gone. And the absence of that person affects the whole team, the whole system is affected. And all of a sudden, wow, what a loss. So-and-so's not here anymore. How are we going to pull this off? Right? Systemic loss. Ambiguous loss, he talks about, or abstract loss. A lack of sense of security because of failure. That could be an ambiguous loss. A lack of confidence because something happened. Kind of an ambiguous, abstract loss. And then, interesting, talked about under ambiguous loss, someone who is physically absent but psychologically present to family members. And that could be a POW, MIA, someone missing in action, someone in the 9/11 in the Twin Towers. Their body has never been found. They're not present, but, there's no closure because no one really knows exactly what happened. And then the opposite of that, someone who is psychologically absent but physically present. Someone who's had an accident, someone who is an older person with Alzheimer's who is there but not really there. And so that's a loss. Remember that movie? Pardon me? No, Beautiful Mind, was that what it was? Beautiful Mind? No, that was schizophrenia, right? What was the other one about the older couple and the woman had Alzheimer's and she didn't even recognize her husband anymore? I don't remember what that was called. That was The Notebook? Oh, okay, The Notebook. Is that a loss? Here's a person I've been married to all these decades, and you go to visit them in the home, the nursing home, and they scream at you like, "Get out of my room, who are you?" Oh my goodness. Talk about memories. Remember when we used to do this together and that together? And like, what are you talking about? I don't even know you. Oh boy, I can't. I mean, that movie did it well. It's like, oh, heart-wrenching. And his love for his wife was just incredible. He talks about disenfranchised grief, and that is, that's interesting. Grief or loss, let's say, as wrong as it is, and it is wrong, but an extramarital affair. Some guy, sin, falls in love with another woman and knows it's wrong and has to give it up, and of course, but to that person, it is extremely difficult. The loss of letting that person go is extremely painful, and that's why God says don't get involved to begin with, so you don't have to have that pain. And that's how it gets so involved and difficult, and someone gets entrapped in those emotional relationships. And God just says don't go there in the first place. And the prohibitions that God gives us is not because he's so stringent and he's such a mean God that wants to deprive us of so many good things, but it's to spare us the pain that comes from, that will be the result of getting involved in those things. Okay. How you doing out there? We're going to have a break very shortly. So disenfranchised grief, and then the impact of loss. Some of these things can be mentioned when there's loss. There's a sense of unreality, depending on how great how important the loss, the thing that was lost was. There's a sense of unreality. We can feel dazed. We can feel numb. We can feel like this is surreal. This isn't really happening. When am I going to wake up from this? This isn't really what's happening. That's certainly a part of it. There's a sense of guilt sometimes with something precious is lost. If only this, if only that, if only I hadn't lent my 65 mint condition GTO to my cousin. It would still be in the garage all shined up. Now it's at the junkyard, totaled, right? If only. Hey, is that a loss? Someone really, that was their pride and joy, their 65 GTO convertible 389 4-barrel 4-speed dual exhaust, right? If that thing was really their prize and joy, all the car shows, and now it's gone. Well, anyways, yes. And then a sense of helplessness because you can't bring it back, sense of regret, sense of unfinished business. How could that be? It's like it's not complete. It's not finished. Bring it back. I'm not ready to lose that. And then the need to understand why. We ask these questions when there's loss. Why? Why? And sometimes that's the wrong question. Why? If it's a loss of a loved one, we won't have the answer. There is no answer. It's God. It's God's sovereignty. That's his issue. The issues of life belong to the Lord. And we need to just bow before him and worship him because his ways are higher than our ways. Okay, so why don't you take a break, and then we'll come back, and please be back at 9:30 because then we'll leave the end of the class for you to work on just a little project. Okay, so that only leaves us in like 15 minutes more of class time, and then we'll be through.